The night air over Babylon vibrates with the collective pulse of a city that believes itself eternal. Torchlight carves deep, erratic paths against the massive, blue-glazed bricks of the Ishtar Gate, making the very stone look as though it might shift or breathe. The scale of the structure is crushing, a testament to endurance that dwarfs the thousands gathered in the streets below. Shadows dance violently along the processional way, stretching and snapping against the high walls as the wind carries the roar of celebration. It is a sound of absolute confidence, a rhythmic, deep-throated humming that echoes off the limestone and mortar. Every flickering flame casts a golden glow that reflects off the glazed surfaces, creating a shimmering illusion of constant motion. The city feels impenetrable, a fortress of brick and pride, but all will soon change and Babylon will fall. Yet, the light is frantic, struggling to hold back the encroaching dark that presses in from the desert beyond the perimeter. The atmosphere is thick with the weight of centuries, a heavy, suffocating grandeur that leaves no room for doubt. Babylon stands, unyielding and vast, while the torches burn toward their inevitable end, casting, flickering, distorted shapes across the immense, silent sentinels of the gate. The heavy bronze doors of the inner palace swing open, and the cold night air is instantly replaced by a wall of heat, spice, and sweat. Inside, the grand hall is a cavern of excess. Hundreds of nobles and high-ranking officials crowd the long tables, their voices rising in a chaotic, overlapping chorus that competes with the rhythmic strumming of lutes. The air is thick with the scent of roasted meats and heavy, sweet wine that flows without pause from overflowing basins. Servants weave through the narrow gaps between the tables, balancing heavy platters and refilling goblets before they can go dry. There is no space for silence here. Every surface gleams with the reflection of 1,000 oil lamps, casting a warm, flickering light that masks the exhaustion on the faces of the weary guests. They lean over the wood, laughing and gesturing, oblivious to the world beyond the palace walls. The floor is slick with spilled wine, and the heat in the room makes the air ripple, distorting the faces of the revelers into a frenzied, endless loop of consumption. It is a spectacle of total security, a fortress built on the assumption that nothing can touch those who hold the wine. The banquet continues, a sprawling, decadent machine of indulgence that consumes every hour of the night. At the center of the dais, Belshazzar reclines on a chair carved from cedar and overlaid with plates of beaten gold. He watches the room with a gaze that demands constant attention. He raises a hand, the rings on his fingers catching the firelight, and the musicians nearest to him falter, their notes trailing off into the sudden cooling air. He does not speak to the nobles. He turns to his servants, his jaw set in a sharp, impatient line. With a flick of his wrist, he issues the command. A ripple of nervous movement begins at the edge of the dais. Servants move toward the heavy, iron-bound chests kept in the palace depths. They return moments later, carrying vessels of silver and gold that do not belong to the palace. These are the artifacts stripped from the temple in Jerusalem, their surfaces etched with distinct, ancient patterns that look out of place amidst the gaudy, heavy luxury of the Babylonian hall. As the vessels are set upon the table, the air in the room seems to grow thin. The king stares at the gold, his eyes reflecting the metal, his posture shifting from casual indulgence to a predatory, singular focus. The boundary between state power and divine provocation has been crossed. Belshazzar grips the base of the silver goblet. His knuckles turn white against the burnished surface. He lifts the vessel, and the light of 100 lamps catches the rim, casting a bright, singular beam across his face. Around the table, the laughter dies. The conversation stops. Replaced by the sound of labored breathing and the scraping of chairs against the stone floor, the king ignores the tension. He holds the cup as if it were a common wine bowl, his movements rhythmic and steady. He leans back, eyes scanning the faces of his guests, daring them to recoil. A servant rushes to pour wine, the red liquid splashing against the holy engravings of the cup. The king does not wait. He brings the vessel to his lips, tilting his head back until the metal obscures his vision of the hall. The room feels impossibly small. Every eye is locked on the king, watching the liquid disappear. He swallows, the sound sharp in the sudden, suffocating quiet. He lowers the cup, a dark stain of wine running down his chin. He has tasted the sacred. The air in the hall vibrates with the weight of the act. A silence so deep it feels like the foundation of the palace itself is holding its breath. Belshazzar slams the goblet onto the table, the metal ringing against the stone. He lets out a sharp, jagged laugh that pierces the heavy air. That sound acts as a trigger. The nobles, sensing the king's approval, erupt into a frenzy of motion. Wine flows freely, splashing over the edges of the temple vessels and soaking into the fine linens. Servants scramble to bring out platters of roasted meats, the smell of grease and charred fat thick enough to coat the tongue. The noise returns, louder than before, a cacophony of shouting, clinking glass, and raucous laughter that vibrates against the massive blue walls of the gate. Men throw their heads back, draining every cup, their eyes wide with a frantic, unearned confidence. They dance, they stumble, they toast to the king's defiance, reveling in their perceived invincibility. The floor is slick with spilled wine. Bodies press against bodies in the cramped, opulent space. No one looks toward the shadows. No one notices the flickering of the torches as they begin to sway against a draft that should not exist. The hall is a cauldron of noise and heat, a final, blinding display of human pride at its absolute zenith, completely oblivious to the judgment hanging in the air. The roar of the banquet hit its apex, a wall of sound that shook the very foundation of the palace. Then, it stopped. Not a gradual fade, but a clean, instantaneous cut. The laughter died in throats. The clatter of metal on stone ceased. The air itself seemed to harden, turning thick and frigid in the blink of an eye. Belshazzar remained in the middle of a gesture, his arms still raised, his mouth parted to speak. The wine in his cup stopped sloshing, settling into a dead, dark surface. He looked around. Every face in the hall was turned toward the wall, expressions shifting from drunken mirth to raw, unadulterated confusion. The torches did not flicker. They stood rigid, their flames pulled toward the ceiling as if caught in an invisible, rising draft. A pressure built behind the eyes of everyone in the room, a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the floorboards and into the marrow of their bones. The king tried to set his cup down, but his hand trembled, and he could not release the handle. He stared into the darkness of the hall, his chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged breaths. The silence was not empty. It was heavy, expectant, and cold, holding the entire palace in a state of absolute, terrified suspension. The plaster surface, smooth and untouched, began to ripple. It was not a trick of the flickering light, but a physical distortion of the stone itself. A shadow emerged, deep and ink black, detaching from the wall as if the masonry were opening into a void. Then, fingers appeared. They were not solid, nor were they transparent. They possessed a terrifying, solid clarity that defied the laws of the room. The hand moved with a slow, agonizing deliberation. It reached out, pressing against the cold blue bricks. The nobles stood like statues, their lungs refusing to draw air. Every eye in the hall was locked onto the movement of those fingers. The hand did not tremble. It traced a path through the dust and the plaster, its motion smooth and rhythmic. It carried the weight of something ancient, something that had been waiting for this exact moment to reveal itself. The silence in the room deepened, becoming so absolute that the sound of a single heartbeat seemed to echo off the ceiling. The hand paused, hovering for a fraction of a second, before it began the work of carving. The air around the wall grew frigid. The guests felt the prickle of fear at the base of their necks, a primal signal that something beyond the mortal realm had arrived to claim the space. The fingers bit into the plaster, leaving glowing trails of light that burned against the dim room. The first word, MENE, seared itself into the wall with a harsh, rhythmic pulse. The light deepened, casting long, stark shadows that stretched across the floor toward the banquet tables. The hand continued, carving the second MENE, then TEKEL, and finally PARSIN. Each letter hummed with a low, vibrating frequency that set the teeth of every witness on edge. The illumination was not warm. It was cold and piercing, reflecting off the polished surface of the floor. Belshazzar watched the final stroke complete the message. He stood paralyzed for a heartbeat, his knuckles white as he gripped the rim of his golden goblet. As the final letter solidified into a permanent, glowing script, his fingers lost their strength. The goblet slipped, It struck the stone floor with a sharp, metallic ring that cut through the silence. Wine erupted from the vessel, spreading in a dark, jagged pool across the tiles. The liquid crept toward the base of the wall, soaking into the dust, while the king remained rooted to the spot, his gaze fixed on the burning words that now dominated the entire hall. Belshazzar remained motionless, his eyes wide and fixed upon the glowing script. The blood retreated from his face, leaving his skin a sallow, deathly gray. He tried to take a step backward, but the muscles in his legs betrayed him. A violent tremor started at his knees, causing them to knock together with a rhythmic, audible clatter. His jaw went slack, his mouth hanging open as he struggled to find air that felt increasingly thin and cold. He reached out, clutching at the air, looking for support that was not there. His frame, once upright and commanding, now sagged under the weight of an invisible burden. He shifted his weight from side to side, but his feet would not obey his commands. Every muscle fiber in his lower body twitched in a desperate, failed effort to hold him upright. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles straining until they turned ivory white, but his grip slipped on the polished surface. Slowly, uncontrollably, he began to sink toward the floor. The hall remained deathly silent. The only sound, the frantic, irregular breathing of the man who had only moments ago ruled the room with absolute authority. He was no longer a king, he was a man witnessing his own end. Belshazzar forced his voice into a jagged roar, demanding an explanation from the shadows. He pointed a trembling finger at the wall, his hand shaking so violently the motion was a blur. The gathered wise men shifted, their movements hesitant and stiff. They stepped into the center of the hall, eyes darting toward the glowing letters, then quickly away. One by one, they reached the base of the wall, peering at the script with squinted eyes. They leaned in, their breathing audible in the suffocating silence, but their lips remained sealed. No words came. They traced the air in front of the letters, their fingers hovering inches from the stone, but they drew back as if burned by the intensity of the light. They looked at each other, then back to the king, their expressions blank and hollow. Belshazzar kicked a chair aside, the wood splintering against the floor, and grabbed the nearest scholar by the shoulder. He shook the man, demanding a translation, but the man only stared at the floor, his frame rigid with terror. The king shoved him away, his chest heaving. Every advisor in the room stood frozen, their mouths opening and closing in a futile, silent rhythm. The message remained locked, mocking them all, while the king's desperation spiraled into a blind, frantic rage that filled the entire hall. Belshazzar paced the length of the hall, his boots striking the floor with a rhythmic, frantic thud. He shoved a heavy table aside, sending silver vessels clattering across the mosaic tiles. The nobles pressed themselves against the pillars, eyes wide, breath held. Then, the double doors at the far end of the hall swung open. The queen stepped into the light. She did not run. She did not shout. She walked through the center of the room with steady, measured strides, her gaze fixed directly on the glowing script. The panicked murmurs of the court died instantly. She reached the center of the hall and stopped, ignoring the trembling king. She turned, her posture perfectly still, and scanned the faces of the terrified officials. Her voice cut through the stagnant air, clear and resonant. She spoke of a man from the old days, a man who possessed the insight of the gods. She did not stutter. She did not hesitate. She named him clearly, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Daniel, she pointed toward the outer chambers, her finger steady as stone. She instructed the king to summon him, claiming he alone held the key to the riddle. The king stopped his pacing, his chest heaving, his eyes locking onto hers. The room held its breath, the tension shifting from blind panic to a fragile, sharp-edged anticipation. The doors groaned open once more. A heavy silence descended, thicker than before. Daniel stepped across the threshold, his feet silent on the mosaic tiles. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, his frame lean and upright. He carried no gold, no sign of rank, only the weight of his years. The nobles shifted, their eyes tracking his movement, confused by the simplicity of his presence in a room drowning in excess. He walked the length of the hall, ignoring the spilled wine and the overturned furniture. He did not look at the nervous guards or the sweating courtiers. He passed through the center of the crowd, and the people parted for him, leaning back as if his very presence disrupted the heavy, stagnant air of the feast. He reached the foot of the throne, his eyes shifting upward. He looked at the glowing letters on the wall, then back to the king. He stood firm, his hands at his sides, breathing steadily. He did not bow. He did not cringe. He simply waited, an anchor of stillness in a sea of frantic, gilded chaos. The king stared down at him, his mouth agape, the color returning to his face only to fade again as he realized the old man showed no fear of the light. Daniel did not wait for the king to speak. His voice was low, yet it carried to the edges of the hall, cutting through the heavy scent of wine. He began by recounting the days of Nebuchadnezzar, the man who built the very walls that now shook around them. He spoke of how that king had once possessed absolute power, only to be humbled when his heart grew hardened by pride. Daniel stepped closer to the throne, his gaze unwavering. He reminded Belshazzar that the rise of empires was not the work of men, but a fleeting favor granted and withdrawn by a higher authority, God. He listed the king's failures, the desecration of sacred vessels, the arrogance of his banquet, and the refusal to acknowledge the source of his own reign. Each word landed like a stone in a still pond. The nobles, who had been whispering moments before, fell into a complete, suffocating silence. Belshazzar gripped the arms of his throne, his knuckles white, his jaw set in a futile attempt to maintain his composure. Daniel pointed toward the glowing letters on the wall, stripping away the king's thin veneer of royal defiance. He made it clear that the time for indulgence had passed, and the hour of judgment had arrived. The king's face tightened, his arrogance crumbling under the cold, historical truth of the rebuke. Daniel turned his back on the throne and faced the glowing, hovering script. He began with the first word, MENE. He spoke clearly, his voice echoing against the stone pillars. It meant that God had numbered the days of the kingdom and brought it to a definitive end. He moved to the second, TEKEL. He explained that the king had been weighed on the scales of judgment and found wanting, his worth hollowed by arrogance. The final word, PARSIN, hung in the air for a heartbeat before Daniel provided the grim conclusion. The kingdom was to be split, divided among the Medes and the Persians. As the last syllable left his lips, the light from the wall flared, casting sharp, jagged shadows across the faces of the nobles. The ambient sound of the city outside seemed to vanish, replaced by a crushing, absolute silence. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. The finality of the message settled into the room like a physical weight. Pressing down on the shoulders of every person present, the king remained slumped in his seat, his eyes locked on the glowing letters, realizing that his reign had not just been challenged, but officially expired. The prophecy was no longer a riddle. It was a death sentence. Belshazzar stared at the wall for a long moment, his chest heaving. The silence in the hall was absolute, broken only by the sharp intake of breath from the surrounding courtiers. The king's hands trembled as he gestured toward his attendants. Desperation flickered in his eyes, a frantic need to exert control even as the foundation of his rule dissolved. He barked an order that barely carried across the room. Servants scrambled forward, moving with jerky, unnatural haste. They produced symbols of high authority, intent on bestowing status upon the man who had just dismantled the king's legacy. They approached Daniel, their movements stiff and clumsy, and placed the heavy tokens of power upon him. It was a hollow display, a frantic attempt to purchase mercy from a fate that had already been written. Daniel stood motionless, his expression unchanged by the sudden elevation in rank. He did not bow, nor did he look at the king with gratitude. He remained a fixed point in the chaos, a man who understood the true value of what was being offered. The king watched, his face a mask of sweating, pale agitation. He had granted Daniel the third place in a kingdom that no longer belonged to him. The prophecy stood, unyielding, while the court watched the king attempt to bribe destiny with empty honors. Miles away from the suffocating tension of the banquet hall, the Euphrates flowed with its usual rhythmic weight. The river had always been the city's greatest guardian, a liquid wall that no army could hope to cross. But tonight, the natural order faltered. Upstream, a massive network of laborers labored in the dark, carving channels into the soft earth. The water hesitated. It swirled, hitting the new, artificial banks, and began to redirect its course. Slowly, the level against the city's inner walls started to sink. The sound of the current changed from a roar to a low, gurgling hiss. Muddy banks emerged, slick and glistening under the moonlight, revealing debris that had been submerged for decades. The water retreated, inch by agonizing inch, pulling back from the base of the fortifications. Where there had been deep, impassable currents only hours ago, there was now a sprawling, wet path of silt and stone. The riverbed, once the ultimate defense, had become a bridge. The Persians stood ready in the darkness, watching the final pools of water drain away. The path was clear. The city's greatest secret had been laid bare, and the final barrier between the invaders and the gates had effectively vanished. The army moved in silence. Thousands of feet crunched across the wet, exposed silt of the riverbed. No alarms sounded. The guards on the walls remained oblivious, their attention fixed on the empty horizon rather than the path beneath their feet. The Persians reached the base of the massive water gates. They expected heavy resistance, reinforced iron, or locked bars. Instead, they found the gates unlatched. The city had been left open by its own complacency. A single, sharp command echoed through the damp tunnel. The soldiers pushed. The heavy gates groaned on rusted hinges and swung inward. The invaders poured through the breach like a tide. They surged into the labyrinth of streets, their weapons drawn, moving toward the sound of music and laughter. Inside the palace, the revelry reached its peak. The wine continued to flow. The dancers spun. No one heard the sudden, rhythmic thud of boots against the stone floors of the outer courtyard. The door to the banquet hall burst open. The music stopped instantly. The laughter died in the throats of the guests as the first Persian blades caught the torchlight. The feast was over. The sun crested the horizon, casting a pale, unforgiving light over the city. Where the banquet hall had once been a cradle of excess, only cold stone and scattered debris remained. The air was thick with the scent of spent torches and cooling ash. Silence had returned to the streets, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a kingdom that had ceased to exist. Soldiers stood motionless atop the walls, their work finished. The riverbed was still damp, a grim reminder of the path that had led to this collapse. Inside the palace, the gold vessels were overturned on the floor, their luster dulled by the gray dust of the morning. The absolute power that had defined the city for generations had been dismantled in a single night of tactical precision. No voices rose to challenge the new order. The transition from supremacy to defeat was total. As the light intensified, it revealed the scale of the transformation. The gates were broken, the streets were empty, and the empire that had considered itself eternal was now nothing more than a memory carved into the earth. The night had taken everything. The sun of that final morning eventually set, only to rise again thousands of times over the following ages. The stone of the great walls did not remain imposing. Time acted with more patience than any army. Wind became the primary inhabitant of the city, carrying grit that scoured the glazed bricks until their blue luster vanished into gray. The processional way filled with drifting silt. What was once the center of the world became a landscape of mounds and craters. Rain carved channels into the foundation, and the sun baked the exposed earth into brittle clay. Travelers passing through the region would later stumble upon these low, jagged ridges, unaware that the foundations of a superpower lay beneath their feet. The grand architecture that once defied the horizon now serves only as a bed for desert scrub. Every year, the dunes shift, claiming another fragment of a wall or a decorative tile. The wind pulls at the edges of the debris, grinding the remnants of the past into fine, indistinguishable powder. Nothing remains of the height of the palace or the width of the gates. Only the silence of the desert persists, burying the memory of the city under layers of shifting, indifferent sand. The story of that night remains more than a record of conquest. It is a mirror. It warns that pride blinds those who believe their foundations are unshakable. The king who sat at his table, surrounded by the spoils of a stolen temple, could not see the hand that moved against him until the final moment. It is a recurring pattern in the history of man. Power shifts, boundaries dissolve, and the structures built to defy time eventually yield to the persistent erosion of reality. Today, The phrase, "the writing on the wall," serves as a sharp reminder of the fragility inherent in all absolute authority. We look at the mounds of earth and the scattered, weathered bricks, and we see the truth of our own limitations. No empire is exempt from the gravity of its own hubris. Every wall, no matter how thick or high, eventually surrenders to the desert. The dust that fills the air over those ruins is not just sand. It is the remnants of ambition that once thought itself eternal. In the end, the wind clears the stage, leaving only the quiet, indifferent landscape. Pride blinds, power shifts, and even the greatest monuments crumble into the silent, waiting earth. Babylon had fallen. But the story of Daniel was far from over, and the visions that came to him in the years that followed would become some of the most mysterious prophecies in the Bible.